Okay, hello, and welcome to the first, well, would be the introduction to basically the World of Saga, which is a world that I spent upwards of, well over a decade writing and compiling. Sorry if I go quiet. I'm making drinking because my throat's quite sore at the moment. So, I figured for this first one we'd do like a general overview rather than anything else. Keep it nice and general. Saga is basically a medieval fantasy setting in which, you know, it's mainly brought about with a leaning towards classical history and ancient history, because my degree, my undergraduate degree, was in classics and ancient history, and even long before then, you know, I've been a big enthusiast on ancient history and classics. So I figured, you know, I've always wanted to make a setting that was a fantasy setting, but there are so many settings out there at the moment. Literally, so many settings that are just, you know, generic, cookie cutter, you know, Lord of the Rings pretenders or Game of Thrones pretenders, or, you know, and I didn't want to see a single orc, elf or dwarf in a setting for once, you know. I wanted it to be about human history, and even George Martin in Game of Thrones, he couldn't resist throwing in the more cheesy fantasy elements, like, you know, like big old monsters that come to kill everyone, and, you know, like the others and things. And he said that his books were supposed to be about the human heart in war with itself, which is what I want mine to be. Basically, I want my world to be that. But, you know, there are no other races in this world apart from humans. That's it. You know, there's nothing. There's no children of the forest. There's no orcs. There's no goblins. There's no nothing. It's all humans and human history, because I find that utterly fascinating. So, instead of being based in mythology, it's based in history. It has leanings in mythology, but it's based on Roman, Greek, Persian, ancient history, as well as Japanese and Chinese medieval history, and European as well. There's a lot of later European medieval history in there too. So, I figured in this brief overview I wouldn't be going into any lore really. I thought I'd just give you like a lay of the land, pretty much. Just so, you know, you've got a lay of the land. You can go from west to east, so you know exactly, not exactly where things are, but where different cultures are in the world and how they relate to one another. Because the next campaign we're going to do is called Asunder on the channel, and it is literally going to be the biggest one we've ever done, and will probably be the last campaign I actually do for a long time. So I want it to be sort of the magnum opus that I can look back on and say, okay, that, you know, that's going to be on the internet forevermore, and that's my thing. That's my, you know. I've done 2 campaigns in Saga before, which is what this world is called, Saga. Both of them went really well, for the most part, and we've told some pretty amazing stories, which I may go into as we go along in this series. But first of all, this is generally going to be a brief overview. I'm breaking the fourth wall in this first one, just to tell you a little bit about the world, how I came up with it, where different cultures are taken from, and then in the next one, I think we're going to go empire and kingdom by empire and kingdom, you know, and I can basically show you what power, you know. I will stay in lore character in the next videos. You know, I'll make sure that the fourth wall isn't really broken. I'm just explaining to you what the lore is of these different kingdoms and where they're from and what their motivations are. So, I think we'll start in the west, probably. Saga is bigger than Earth. It's a lot bigger than Earth. It's about 3 to 4 times the size of Earth. So, the land you're seeing on any map will be generally around about the same size as Europe, Africa, and probably America, all jumbled in, you know. So this is kind of like a small part of the world. There are other parts of Saga that haven't been explored, quite frankly. In the west, there is a a massive continent called the Wreath Continent, and the Wreath Continent is essentially where the first kingdoms and empires of humans first started coming into being. It's basically the land of origin. It's the land where everybody in the world technically comes from, and it's the oldest power in the world. It's an imperial power, and basically the Valenrethians, they have the best of everything. They have the best climate, the best crops, the best. They are consider themselves to be the firstborn of the world. You know, they are the first people to really have an empire, and their empire was called actually the First Empire. And the First Empire stretched from the west. Actually, it conquered the known world. It didn't conquer the south, because that's a whole other business that we'll get into. But it basically conquered the whole civilized world, and for like a century held it all together. Until it actually all fell apart. And it fell apart because its capital city was actually an island city, an artificial island called Valen. And Valen, this is a trope that I really do like in fantasy settings, is that there's always an Atlantis or something like that that gets destroyed and brings down a civilization, and that's exactly what happens to the Valenrethians. Valen itself is destroyed, pulled back under the waves from where it was. And the empire collapses. Now, leading from that, the actual island itself, the artificial island that Valen was on, 1 second, was made by the Binding, and the Binding is Saga's answer to magic. Now, I've never been a big fan of magic. I've always thought magic is a bit of a crux that writers use to get out of explaining certain things. Just go, oh, it's just magic, you know. It just really winds me up. So, the Binding isn't actually magic at all. It's actually more of an X-Men style. You know, there are certain people whose evolution has just gone and jumped a couple of centuries, and there are people who are born in this world who have the capability of basically using the Binding. So I'm really sorry, my throat is killing right now, but the Binding is it's an ethereal power that basically encompasses the world and runs through everything, kind of like the Force. And you can conjure up lightning or fire, or you can heal people, or you can have insane reflexes and regenerative powers. That's what the Binding is, and it has nearly limitless potential. The more you learn, the more powerful you can become. So, you know, there's a lot of people who are very much afraid of it, and Valenreath in the west is actually where the Binding was first used to create things. Like Valen, the actual island of that Valen was on was raised up from the sea using the Binding. It was maintained by the Binding, and when Valen was cast back under the sea again, the Spire Church, which was the main religion of the Valenrethian Empire at that point, the First Empire, they actually denounced the Binding and said it was the Binding's fault that the people, you know, using the power of the gods to make their own lives better, and the gods destroyed them for their hubris, basically, and cast Valen back into the sea. The Valenrethians had a different idea, though. They said, no, the Spire Church orchestrated this to gain power and get people into their dogmatic religion that has no place for the Binding in it. So, eventually, the Spire Church left Valenreath. It was kicked out and went west. over the seas, over the breaking seas, to a place called Caledanian, which is just a Celtic word in this setting for Dragonland. So we've gone from Valenreath in the west to the central, to the central continent. Central continent is called Valenreath. Not Valenreath, sorry, Caledanian. Now, Caledanian is actually... I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Valenreath is basically an amalgamation in terms of culture of the Roman Empire and Republic, mixed in with the Persian Empire and a lot of the Greek, a lot of Greek civilization. So the architecture there, you'll see, columned buildings. You'll see lots of marble. They use very Latin names. It's all built up in this one place. If you imagine an amalgamation of all those empires in a really sun-drenched, luscious place, and then throw in magic, that's what Valenreath is. And since the time of the emperors, it's actually become even more in tune with the binding. The binding is even more of a thing over there now than it was. The Spire Church has no jurisdiction there whatsoever, even though they invented the Spire Church, ironically. Now, the Spire Church actually went to Caledanian, which is the central continent. It's an island continent. Actually, no, it's not anymore. I tell a lie. It's actually attached in the north to the Valenrethian continent, but there's no real way of marching across that land space because it's basically barren wasteland that no army can really get across because there'd be no way to get supplies over there. So Caledanian's basically a really large peninsula on which it's basically medieval Europe if the Romans never existed. Now that means that it's much more of a Celtic society. It's grown up to be much more of a Celtic, Gaulish, tribal society, and the tribes eventually created kingdoms, and which are called Caeldoms in this setting. And this place was conquered by the Valenrethian Empire back in the day, and eventually, with the fall of Valen, Caledanian rose up as one in rebellion and cast out the Valenrethian Empire. So it wasn't a province anymore. It was actually a set of four great Caeldoms. These four basically massive kingdoms that are basically medieval Europe in this setting. It's the most recognisable fantasy place, Caledanian. So if you wanted to know, if you wanted somewhere nice and easy where you can just create a character or create a person who is just, a normal knight, because knights are a thing in Caledanian, then Caledanian is the place to go. It looks the most like what we're used to from fantasy fiction. Alright, let's move to the south for now, because the south is something that I find really interesting. The south is actually a place called the Lost Continent, and it's called the Lost Continent because it's actually drifting away from everywhere else. Again, this world is many times the size of Earth, at least 3 or 4 times the size of Earth. So, and the equator is actually in the north of the world of Saga, the known world. So the further north you go, the hotter it gets. The further south you go, the colder it gets. And the Lost Continent is drifting away from Caledanian and Valenreath very steadily. It's going further and further south into the cold. It's like being dragged down into the ice flats. So life is becoming more and more harsh, and it's a constant struggle down there across the sleet seas from Caledanian. So this is actually called the Empire of Shards, or just Shardland, and it is inhabited by basically this world's answer to Vikings and the Nordic tribes like Jutes and Saxons and people like that. They are the greatest raiders in the world. They're great sailors, and they're adept at eking out or living wherever they can and whenever they can. That's basically who they are as a people. They are very fatalistic, and they're pretty much Vikings who are going through Ragnarok, but very slowly. You know, they're going through the end of the world as far as they're concerned, but very slowly, because their home is disappearing into the south. There was a big conflict between the new Kael'dams of the central continent in Kaeldanian and the people of Shardland when it became apparent that the lost continent was disappearing off the edge of the world. They invaded Kaeldanian en masse and were eventually defeated but settled there in the south of Kaeldanian. So at least a few of them got to safety. It's still there now. The Empire of Shards is still there, and it's not really an empire. It's more of a loose conglomerate of communities and raiders who all stick together and try to survive. But all the people who are left there, they know that they are destined to die out, because the further they go from Kaeldanian and Valenreath and any other continent, the harder it becomes to just sail there and set up a new life. So it's getting pretty grim down there. And it breeds grim people. Again, all of these cultures we'll go into them in more detail eventually. So let's go into the east now. The east is basically our answer to Japanese and Mongolian and Chinese medieval history, which I have a huge passion for. The eastern continent is called the Mist Continent, and it has in the north of it, in the hotter parts, the really hotter parts, there is Gensen, which is basically, imagine medieval Japan without all of the well, it's still quite rigid, but not anywhere near as rigid as actual medieval Japan. They have similar armor. They wear similar armor. They have similar customs and styles of dress. And over the mountains to the south of that, there is Menshai. And Menshai is basically medieval China. It's a huge imperial state with vast resources, and it's basically the breadbasket of the entire world in Menshai. And Gensen and Menshai have fought many, many times, because this is basically Japan and China sharing the same continent rather than having any water between them. And so they've gone to war many times. And this place was actually conquered by the First Empire as well. So Valenreath in the west, it conquered Kaeldanian in the central part of the world, and it conquered the Mist Continent as well. So this whole swathe of the central part of the world as it's known was actually conquered by the First Empire. So when Valen fell and the central continent of Kaeldanian went into rebellion, all of the legions, the Valenreathian legions who were keeping the peace, they entered Kaeldanian from Menshai and Gensen, where they were garrisoned, and they were annihilated by the people of Kaeldanian, basically their armies. And when that happened, Gensen and Menshai just reverted back to their previous governments and said, yeah, we're no longer part of the Empire, screw that, they can't get to us. And so the Empire actually fell apart in the east with a bit of a whimper. Like, it never, it never had a grandstand finish in the east, it just went away. And Menshai and Gensen went back to fighting each other, as they do. Just have a little drink. Now, to the north, the continent that Valenreath is on is massive. And when I say massive, it's literally 2 or 3 Africas massive. So you got to imagine, like, the Valenreathian continent in the west is the most fertile part of it, and then it stretches north and east. And as it stretches north and east, there's a peninsula that shoots off downwards, southwards. That is Kildanian. And then further east still and north, there's another shoot-off part that comes down. That is actually a place called the Crown of the World, it's called. And these are deserts, huge, massive deserts that have oases in them. And basically a massive force of tribal warriors, tribal riders, united under the Asunder Pact in the city of Asunder. May sound familiar, considering what the campaign's going to be called. And they raced south, and they conquered everything around them. So basically all of those northern deserts are now theirs, and they renamed it the Brimstone Empire, after the Brimstone Ocean that is over that way. Essentially, they went south and crossed the sea into Gensen, instead of going to Kildanium, because they saw Gensen as the more juicier prize. It was more ripe for conquest, and they crossed over there and fought a generation-long war to conquer Gensen. And you can imagine how fatalistic and rigid-backed the Japanese actually are. Imagine if the Mongolians actually got to to Japan, which they very nearly did. They were stopped by a tsunami. Like, they were stopped by the divine wind, basically. Where their fleets were destroyed in real history. But in my history, my world, the Mongols, the Asunder, actually get to Japan and grind it down into the dust, finally taking Kairu, which is the version of Kyoto, and burning it to the ground. So yeah, in the setting at the moment, the Asunder Empire, or the Brimstone Empire, covers all of the north, basically, like all of the habitable space in the north, the deserts up there, and it covers Gensen, basically. And they're looking at Menshai with and licking their lips as their next joint of conquest. So that's the known world, basically, in a very quick rundown. Each of these places has its own customs, its own armaments, armies, rights of kingship, cultures, and religions and creeds. And we're going to get into all of them. I think it's going to be like a 10-part series. But for now, this was the introduction to the world itself. It's very quick. You know, not as long as I thought it was going to be. I literally want this to just be like a nice introduction, so you guys can just take it in and get ready for the next one. I hope that this was informative. I hope that it helps when we finally get to showing you a map next time around and showing you how things relate to each other. That's pretty much it for now. I have nothing else really to say. I could go on, but I don't really see the point right now, because then we'll be going into getting more in depth and more in detail. This world does have things like dragons in it, but again, they're just dragons. They're literally in every setting ever. But we've avoided tropes like more cheesy uses of magic, elves, dwarves, orcs, hobbits, whatever. You know, there's none of that. There's no gunpowder. Gunpowder is just becoming known in the world, so, you know, crossbows are a thing. You know, this is very much a medieval fantasy land. So, I think next time we'll be going into Valenreath, the history of Valenreath, and the First Empire, which is basically the history of most of the world for a long time. And we'll also get into the binding and what it does, what it means, and how it works, and what people's different reactions are to it in the world. But for now, that is Saga. Thank you very much for joining me, and I will speak to you next time around. Peace.